La señora Colau, que como saben es la alcaldesa de Barcelona y presidenta del Área Metropolitana de Barcelona, me ha pedido que les transmita en primer lugar sus excusas por no poder atender estas sesiones, que está siguiendo detalladamente y con la que he tenido ocasión de hablar. La excusa es buena hoy porque precisamente se está inaugurando en este momento un ejemplo de lo que ayer les planteaba al señor Salvador Rueda sobre las superinas, sobre las supermanzanas. Les invito, si todavía les queda tiempo antes de marchar de Barcelona, que puedan visitar el entorno del Mercat de Sant Antoni, donde se han unido una gran cantidad de calles, de plazas, para crear este nuevo espacio público. Ada Colau me ha pedido que comparta con ustedes la que ella cree que en este momento sintetiza la principal problemática en que la mayoría de las ciudades y áreas metropolitanas están sufriendo, que es el problema de la vivienda. En este momento este es el gran problema, o uno de los grandes problemas en la ciudad de Barcelona y en la área metropolitana de Barcelona, cómo atender el problema de una residencia digna y cómo evitar los lanzamientos, las evicciones, ante el fenómeno de la conversión de la ciudad en un producto financiero, en un producto de especulación, cómo está afectando esto a las personas y cómo alrededor del problema de la vivienda se reúnen todos los aspectos que han estado tratando aquí, las desigualdades, la inmigración, la exclusión social, etc. Por tanto, su preocupación que quiere compartir con ustedes es la importancia que en esta nueva agenda urbana de Naciones Unidas UN Habitat, se introduzca con fuerza el protagonismo de las áreas metropolitanas y se introduzca el tema de la vivienda. Asistimos hoy a una cierta dejación por parte de los estados, delegación en las ciudades de que sí, atended vosotros el problema de la vivienda, atended vosotros el problema de los inmigrantes, atended vosotros el problema de la pobreza, pero no nos dan a las ciudades ni a las áreas metropolitanas los recursos necesarios para hacer eso. Y sería bueno instar a Naciones Unidas que intenten, en la medida de lo posible, puesto no deja de ser una unión de estados, en exigir que en Hábitat 3, en los siguientes periodos, se dé mayor protagonismo a las áreas metropolitanas, se desestatilicen las políticas al entorno de estas cuestiones y, en definitiva, se acerquen los recursos y también las soluciones en manos de las ciudades. El segundo motivo que les acompaño aquí es para presentar la última de las conferencias que tenemos en este interesante seminario, que nos va a dar el compañero y el amigo Gardner, que, como ustedes saben, es especialista en temas de investigación en el Worldwatch Institute. Ha formulado prácticamente 15 de las últimas ediciones del State of the World, este interesante manual al que todos acudimos para conocer un poco cuál es la situación de las ciudades y del mundo desde el punto de vista de la sostenibilidad, que nos va a hablar de un tema ciertamente interesante, como mínimo sugerente en el título, ¿no? The Elephant in the Room, Cities and the Future of the Consumption. Vamos a ver qué pasa con este elefante en medio de nuestra habitación. Esta es una expresión inglesa. Nosotros hablamos también del elefante en la cacharrería, ¿no? El elefante que acaba destruyendo todo. Tenemos un tiempo limitado porque vamos con cierto retraso, por lo tanto, él se va a ajustar al término de media hora y seguidamente vamos a abrir un turno de palabras. Gracias. Adelante. Puedes hacerlo desde aquí o como quieras. Gracias. A ti.
Bueno, no estoy acostumbrado a manejar esta máquina. ¿Aquí? No. ¿Cómo se abre?
Pues
se abre.
Sí, ya.
Sí, eso.
¿Ok?
Perfecto.
Y luego supongo que para aquí, ¿no?
Aquí no. Ahí,
En eso, ¿verdad?
Sí.
Here it is. Adelante.
Muy bien. Aquí no. Bueno, buen día, buenos días, good morning or good afternoon to everyone. It's wonderful to be here in Barcelona once again, and I really want to thank the metropolitan area of Barcelona for inviting me and representing Worldwatch at this great Congress. It really is wonderful to be interacting with so many of you today. I am at the Worldwatch Institute, which does, as you've heard from Salvador, does many different kinds of sustainability investigation research. And so I've done many issues over the years, including we did a volume on cities, sustainable cities, in 2016. So today I'm going to marry a little bit of that knowledge with some previous work on consumption to talk about consumption in cities. And because the particular way that consumption manifests in cities is a new area for me, I have a lot of research questions, which is why I've called this a research agenda. So I will have probably more questions than answers, and maybe you can help me with those. So today I'll be looking very briefly at the modern world and the problem of consumption, consumption trends in cities, and then the response to consumption trends. There's a good response, which is to pursue greater efficiency. There's a better response, which is to redesign whole systems. And there's a needed response, one that we don't give much attention to, which is sufficiency. It's an area that we usually tend not to talk about. It's the elephant in the room. So I'm going to go very quickly through this because you know most of these data already, and Salvador Rueda emphasized them very well yesterday. So we live in an urban world, 79 million people, that's 15 populations of Barcelona, are added to city populations every year. So if we meet again next year at the same time, we can talk about the 15 new Barcelonas that have been added to the world, and I hope they're as nice as the original. The number of megacities in the world, cities of 10 million or more, has grown more than 15-fold to 29 in 2015. I think we're up to 33 now, and 43 coming in 2030. So urban populations are growing very rapidly. All of this is taking place, of course, in a context of limits that are being breached. And we know that from various measures, from the ecological footprint that says we're using more of renewable resources than we can sustain over time, the planetary boundaries research, which says of 9 planetary boundaries, 4 are breached and are considered to pose a high level of risk, and 2 face uncertain risks. Another way, I think, to present the problem is through this periodic table of the elements. This came from the Global Economic Forum, I believe, this year, which used this table to depict depleted elements on our planet today. So the darker the square, the more depleted and the more in danger of depletion is that element. And you can see there are quite a number here. Another study that came out just a few weeks ago, so it's probably not very well known, is called The Good Life for All. And it basically asks the question, can we provide a good life for everybody on the planet within environmental boundaries? And their answer was yes, but not at high levels of consumption. At higher levels of consumption, we would need 2 to 6 times the resources that we have to provide for everybody at a high level of consumption. And you can see this in the graphic to the right, which is not from that study. This is a different, an older graphic that basically graphs biocapacity per person against, the ecological footprint per person against human development. And so you can see that the area where we want to be on this graphic is in the lower right corner, the blue box, because that's where we have a high level of development and a low ecological footprint. How many countries are in that blue box? 0. As you can see, the countries that come closest to it are in Latin America. So again, it's just to emphasize that the challenge that Salvador talked about yesterday is very real, that we have very little time and that we need to be on top of this as quickly as possible. So this raises for me some various questions. What kinds of consumption tend to rise the most and the least when people move to cities? to what extent can consumption in cities be shifted from non-renewable to renewable materials? We know that the industrial civilization is built very heavily on renewable materials, and that is not a sustainable situation. What role does greater urban density play in reducing urban materials consumption? So again, very quickly through this set of slides on trends in cities and resource consumption. We know that cities account for a lot of energy consumption and natural resource consumption and for carbon emissions. They also tend to bring more affluence, which is a good thing. We want for people to be prosperous, we want for them to have a lot of opportunity, and that cities seem to be able to provide. There are now more than 3 billion people in the global middle class, and soon a majority of the people on the planet will live in the middle class or will be wealthy. 140 million or so people join the middle class every year, and this is set to rise. So more and more people are moving up the ladder of prosperity. And it's a very interesting historical footnote in State of the World 2016, where we talked about cities. We had a history of materials use in cities. There's some very interesting research that's done on this. And a researcher, I believe from Austria, who studies urban metabolism, noted that from the year 1 to the year 1500, there was a 5-fold increase in environmental impact in the world. And of that increase, population and affluence were about equally responsible. There's a lot of times we have this debate: is it population, is it spending, is it consumption? Well, at that time, up for those first 1,500 years, it was about equally, the blame could be cast equally in both areas. But starting in 1500, we have the scientific revolution and then the industrial revolution. Environmental impact increases tenfold. And affluence, this time, consumption, is responsible for about 3 times more impact than population growth. So affluence is really a driver of the degradation that we see around us. The other very interesting point that was made in this research is that technology over this period increased impact by about 1.5 times, which for me is very interesting because a lot of times, we say, gosh, we live in this world that is falling apart, there's environmental degradation everywhere, there's social demise, and what are we going to do about that? The first thing that comes to mind for most people is technology will save us. Technology will help us. And I have no doubt that technology has a major role to play in building sustainable cities. But this is very sobering to note that it's not necessarily going to take us where we want to be. The United Nations Environment Program did a report earlier this year on materials use in cities. And they noted that in 2010, there were about 40 billion tons of materials that were used in cities around the world. And they projected that under business as usual conditions, that would grow to 90 billion tons. So more than a doubling in just the next, 32 years. On a per capita basis, that would be 8 to 17 tons for every person in the year 2015. So each of us using 8 to 17 tons of materials every year. UNEP proposes that for sustainable cities, we need to bring that per capita number down to 6 to 8 tons per person. In other words, we need to cut materials use in half. So think about your own lives. What in your life are you willing to give up? Of course, we don't have to frame the question that way, but it helps to drive home the magnitude of the challenge that we have, is how can we reduce materials use by that amount, by 50%. So again, this basically shows the same thing, but I call your attention to the 40% increase in domestic materials consumption. That's all the materials that come from within, don't include imports and exports. That is set to increase by 40% per person. This is per person by 2050. Remember, I started out by talking about the environmental problems that we have in this world and how we are broaching limits. We're going beyond limits, and there are many different measures that show us that. This is saying that our bet is that we're going to go further beyond in terms of materials use by 40% more per person. Obviously not a sustainable situation. And yet there are needs. People need, especially in developing countries, need actually in many cases to consume more. There's tremendous infrastructure needs in Asia, as you can see here. $26 trillion projected to be spent by 2030. And you can see why. People want and need good transportation, comfortable, safe transportation. These are very real needs that can't be ignored. We'll see more and more waste. The World Bank says that waste levels will increase by 69% by 2025, and that the peak in global waste under business as usual conditions would not come before 2100. So we will continue to generate this waste at ever increasing rates if we don't change our ways. Now this I want to pause for a moment because this is important and it takes a moment to sink in. These are data about Europe from the European Union that looked at various sectors of economies and looked at the share of materials use that those sectors use and the share of greenhouse gas emissions. I divided these into less intensive and more intensive sectors, so that's a choice that I made. And I'm not sure, you can't really see it, but I don't know if this has a, yeah. For the less intensive sectors, you see that they use only 14% of materials and 11.5% of greenhouse gas emissions. All the rest, the numbers you can't see down here probably, are 85 and 88% for materials share and greenhouse gas emissions share. Those 85 and 88% come from the more intensive sectors. And those more intensive sectors, as you probably know, housing, transport, food, and then a slightly smaller category, furnishings and household equipment. The good news there is we know where to aim our efforts if we want to reduce materials use. We need to focus especially on these four sectors. Unfortunately, cities are decreasing in density, which means that we're using, as we were saying, more materials per person. You can see here that in developing country cities, the built-up area is expected to increase by 200% by 2030, but the population by only 100%. So the per capita area is going to increase. The same thing's going to happen, but even on a much larger scale, there's going to be much more of an increase in industrial country cities. This is not going to help us to reduce materials use, to have cities that are less and less dense. Of course, this graphic gets a lot of attention. It's a little bit old now, but it shows Atlanta on the left, Barcelona on the right, two cities that have roughly the same combination, but very, very different footprints. So that Atlanta's is about 12 times larger than Barcelona's, even though they both have the same population, roughly. Okay, so that's basically, I've talked about the problems, laid out some of the problems that we're facing. Now I'd just like to talk about some of the responses, greater efficiency being the first. It's the first thing we talk about often is we're going to use technology because it's going to make us more efficient. And yes, I believe that is true, but there are many caveats. So the United Nations Environment Program says that a resource-efficient infrastructure could produce really tremendous, almost up to 1/2 the level, reductions of up to 1/2 in the materials use in cities. That's basically what all these numbers add up to. I'll just call your attention to the picture on the right, on the top. That is in Los Angeles, where they installed new lights on many streets. You can see the new lights are on the right side and the old lights are on the left side, so you can see that it's a clear difference. It also turns out that they could recoup the cost of that installation through savings in electricity in 7 years. And that crime in the areas that installed these lights went down. So this was a win-win-win situation. They were able to save energy, save money, and make their streets safer as well. Hooray, that's a good use of technology. We know, of course, we can talk about the Internet of Everything. You all know what that is. I'll just skip down to the case of Nice in France, which has hundreds of sensors that capture data, feed it to a Wi-Fi system that helps them to run traffic. I think you're very familiar with that kind of thing. There's new manufacturing technologies, including things like 3D printing, which have some real potential for reducing the amount of materials that we use, because they allow you to move from creating inventories or manufacturing in a make-to-stock system to manufacturing in a make-to-order system, so that you're only making exactly what will be bought and sold. And of course, there are many technologies for reducing waste, which is a wonderful thing. Technologies for bio-waste, combining waste streams into new products, making CO2, for example, a revenue source, and new packaging technologies that can be composted. All of these technologies offer real promise. Well, when we talk about efficiency, one of the caveats that I wanted to talk about is the need to think systemically across a system. A lot of times when we think of efficiency in products, we think about the individual product. But in fact, we need to be thinking across the system. So we can talk about cogeneration, for example, that uses waste heat from industrial processes to heat other areas. We can talk about resource-efficient urban components, such as car sharing and electric vehicles, that kind of thing. We need to be thinking how all of these different pieces interact and not think of them in just as individual efforts. But the big caveat that I want to talk about is the rebound effect. And this basically says that some of the gains that we get from efficiency often are lost through greater consumption, right? So efficiency doesn't necessarily mean conservation, which is very surprising, I think, to most people. And there are many examples that are given of this. One that looks over time at Britain and how people in 1700 got most of their light from candles. It was a very inefficient way of getting light, but of course, technologies developed, we became much more efficient at providing light, but of course, consumption then multiplied. And in fact, at the Sandia National Laboratories in New Mexico in the United States, they've done some studies of solid state lighting, which is very efficient, and they believe that widespread adoption of solid state lighting will increase consumption of light by 10 times by 2030. So when we talk about technology as a savior, as something that's really going to help us build sustainable cities, the answer is yes, but it will help us, but we really need to be realistic about how those savings get used in the end. I'll skip this one. So, one question that I would have in research that I'd like to do in the future is how big is the rebound effect? There's a lot of dispute in the literature today about how big that effect really is. Some people say it's so big that it swallows up all of the efficiency gains. Does it manifest differently with different kinds of consumption? And how can it be effectively resisted? A better response to high levels of consumption is system redesign. And here, basically the example I use that I'll go through quickly because I think you all know it is the movement from a linear economy to a circular economy. And of course, a circular economy is one that circulates all the materials, or many of the materials that we try to use. We're back to the periodic table of elements, and again, the darker squares here are in a worse situation. This is showing current rates of recycling. And as you can see, the darker ones are recycled at less than 1%. So many of the elements we use today are not recycled and are not part of a circular economy. Circular economy talks about both technical nutrients, which is on the right side. This is from the Eleanor MacArthur Foundation in Great Britain. And then biological nutrients, which are on the left side. The idea is to get them all to flow back into the economy when When you go from raw materials down to the end of life, you want to recover those materials and send them back into the economy. And the smaller the circle, the smaller the loop back into the economy, the better. Now, the Eleanor MacArthur Foundation sees great potential for a circular economy, that in Europe it could spell a net economic gain of $1.8 trillion per year by 2030. The building sector could cut construction costs in half with industrial and modular processes, and the car sharing, autonomous driving, electric vehicles, and better materials could lower the cost of driving by 75%. Now, a lot of this is really yet to be proven. There's great potential, I believe, here, but we need to take these figures with a grain of salt. And we need to be thinking, which is going to be the point that I'm making, we need to be thinking beyond efficiency and beyond better design, and we'll get to that in just a second. So with circular flows, there are many different strategies. A lot of times we think of circular flows as recycling. If you ask somebody in my country, well, first, they probably wouldn't know what a circular economy is. But if you tried to sort of coax it out of them, they would probably guess it means that their cans and bottles get recycled more frequently. But circular economy is way beyond that, and I think you're all quite familiar with that. It has to do with every stage of production and consumption where we find ways to use materials more intelligently. We can talk about car sharing, which is a great example for me, because here we're talking about cars that people have access to a private car, which a lot of people need, but in fact they are, because people don't own them and they don't have them in their own garage or driveway, many fewer materials are used to provide automobiles in this way. I'm going to skip ahead here. So I would really want to know what real material savings can be expected from a circular economy. Which circular economy strategies offer the greatest material savings, and other such questions. So this is really what I want to get to, which is the need for sufficiency. The idea that we have, those of us in wealthy countries, we have more than enough of what we need. And how do we learn to build economies based on sufficiency? And for me, the place to start with this is not how do we stir economic growth, or how do we increase employment? Those can be important questions. But I think the starting point needs to be, what do people need? What is an economy for? What are we trying to do when we build an economy? I think that should be the starting point. And psychologists have a lot to tell us about this. You know of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. There are many other hierarchies that have been developed since he put this out in 1943. But you can see at the base level, we have physiological needs, food and shelter and that kind of thing. We have safety needs, love and belonging needs, esteem needs, and self-actualization needs. And my question is, can we build economies based on this pyramid rather than the way we currently do? One really interesting insight, I think, into consumption is that we're motivated in different ways by different kinds of things. One is extrinsic materials, such as housing or possessions. We typically overvalue extrinsic materials. We tend to want more of them all the time. And that is because they're static. We become very easily accustomed to them. You buy a house, it's the same house this morning, it's the same house tonight that I walked out of this morning. The car doesn't change. And so we become very quickly accustomed to it and dissatisfied with it, and we get into a competition with peers over these things of extrinsic motivation. We also have intrinsic motivation, which you can think of extrinsic motivation as basically nouns, and intrinsic as basically verbs. These are activities that help us to feel connected, competent, or autonomous. Sports, hobbies, reading, art, that kind of thing. These are dynamic and ever-changing, which makes us less desirous of having more. They also, it turns out, happen to have a much lighter environmental footprint. So, I'm back to the same graphic that I showed before about the various sectors in Europe and their share of materials use, except that this time I have added on the right side the Maslow level of human needs. And what you can see basically is that the less intensive sectors all come from the higher levels of the pyramid, okay? So those are the self-actualization, esteem, love and belonging. All of those things are less materially intensive. Of course, the more intensive sectors are more materially intensive, and those come from the bottom of the Maslow pyramid, physiological and safety areas. So the point here is that since we tend to overconsume in these more intensive sectors, these are where the extrinsic motivation comes in, is it possible for us to shift some of our consumption from these more intensive sectors to the less intensive sectors? Could we be just as satisfied going to a movie or making music with our neighbors as we are with going to a mall and making a purchase? That's the basic question here, and I think it's probably a key to building economies of sufficiency. So what is the materials load, the actual data-filled materials load for each level of Maslow's hierarchy? What policies might actively shift people's consumption preferences away from this excessive consumption to the consumption that has a much lighter footprint? One really important piece about the Maslow hierarchy is that what happens at the higher levels of need is that people are connected, right? They're obviously with love, with esteem, with self-actualization, where you're finding out who you are. All of those things happen through connection, and we know that in cities are areas that provide us with connection. There are many kinds of connection that happen in cities. I'm going to talk about just two very quickly: better physical layouts and more exposure to green areas. Atlanta, we've already said, is not a good example. Which of these is most connected? Which of these street patterns is most connected? Well, it turns out, of course, it's the one on the left. There's been a study that shows that the more intersections there are in a city, the better the health of the people. It's not a panacea, it's not always perfect, but it's certainly better than the pattern on the right, which is Atlanta. Right? Of course, you have the great example here of the supermanzanas. And you look at pictures and can get a feel of what a more connected city would look like, what the physical layout would be like. And of course, we could describe what's in each of these pictures, but we're short on time. We also talk about placemaking in cities, places where people can gather. And you can see on the left, the picture on the left, where parking spaces were taken to make some public sitting area. On the right is the High Line in New York, which was a railway that was converted to public space. And of course, I just love this. My very first trip to Barcelona, I was so impressed. I just happened upon this dance in front of the cathedral, and it was mesmerizing. It was transfixing. And for me, it was a wonderful example of how you can use public space for cultural advancement. But of course, we also need green areas. And these are various pictures of green urban areas, green infrastructure, where you can use waterways, you can make them green and not use as much materials in terms of concrete and that kind of thing. And you're actually producing a good function for city operations as well. Sometimes we talk about green cities, but we don't necessarily feel it. We don't know what it really means. A guy named Timothy Beatley in Virginia has come up with a list of indicators. These are just a few. And it really helps me to understand why my city is not a green city. So 100% of city population lives within 100 meters of a park or green space. There are continuous green corridors from the city center to the periphery. 10% of the urban area is in a wild or semi-wild state. 40% forest cover. And one green feature per 1,000 inhabitants. So a green roof, gardens, trees, that kind of thing. 1.6 kilometers of trails for every 1,000 persons. And one community garden for every 2,500 inhabitants. I mean, think about where you live and ask yourself, how many of these criteria would I find in my city? I think most cities would not have these. So, questions for further study are: how does design and provision of public space affect consumption choices among urban citizens? What kinds of urban design reduce material consumption per person while promoting connections? And how much green area does a city need, in what sizes, and with what pattern of distribution? And I will say that there's some interesting work being done here at the Autonomous University of Barcelona on the question of green spaces and human health. And we have a researcher here who's working on that. So, just to close, toward a less consumptive city. Again, the materials goal is to reduce in half per person, the materials used per person. UNEP says that we could have a 4 to 10-fold increase in resource productivity that would allow us to urbanize in very positive ways. So UNEP is taking a very optimistic kind of stance and is focusing on efficiency and on system redesign. But are efficiency, technology, and circularity enough? We have seen that great take-back policies in Sweden have increased recycling rates to impressive levels: 75% for glass, 90% for paper, 68% for metal. And yet consumption and waste generation continues to rise. Why is it? Because demand itself has not been addressed in their situations. The policies do not address demand reduction. So the last point here is that in high consumption societies, we're unlikely to recycle our way out of the rise in consumption. We need to limit consumer demand. And then there are various ways we could do this. These are mostly ways that are not in operation. Okay, so I'm not giving you answers here. These are ways that potentially could be. So schools offer media literacy today to combat fake news. They also teach environmental education. Why couldn't they teach simple living, which is kind of a combination of the two? It's a way to be a critical media consumer and also to be more thoughtful about the environment. Because the richest life possible, we want to shoot for the richest life possible with the fewest things. An area that doesn't get much attention but could be much more helpful in this area of consumerism is the whole religious area. It's a powerful source of ethics. We saw this encyclical that came out from Pope Francis in 2015 that was very hard on consumerism, as have many previous teachings been. But I can tell you at the grassroots level, those teachings just don't penetrate. So they could be much more powerful. Advertising. There's a challenge. There's a campaign in the UK called Peas Please, which promotes a fund to advance advertising for vegetables. Now, the fact that you have to promote a fund to try to create this advertising just tells you how big the challenge is. But one key point that advertisers make is that you're not selling a product, you're selling happiness. And that brings us then to the end, which is about the happy city. You may be familiar with Charles Montgomery's book, The Happy City. He says the sustainable city has got to promise more happiness than the status quo. It has to be healthier, higher in status, more fun, more resilient. It has to lure us together rather than pushing us apart. It has to reward people for making efficient choices, so not as much consumption. And it has to be a city of hedonic satisfaction, a city of joy. Right? That is a happy city. That is what we're after. So we want a new urban consumption model that needs to be cultural and social, not just technical. That's where sufficiency comes in. It's a cultural and social response. Promotes a new understanding of happiness, it values sufficiency, and it redesigns infrastructure and policies to promote connection and sufficiency. So with that, I'll stop and take your questions. Thank you very much.
People here can put more, 3 or 4 questions, no more. We will gather all the questions and answer it in one way. Please, any question? Yeah.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was really very, very interesting and enlightening. I want to ask you about the differences between different regions of the world in the way that they are basically using materials and creating new, for example, urban environments and things like that. Do you think that places like, for example, in the developing world, like in Asia or in Africa, are making the same mistakes that we did last century? That basically they are repeating the same patterns of building outside the cities high rises and things like that, creating challenges for transportation and the need for new highways and the need for new, more infrastructure just to move people around, which they shouldn't need to. They should be trying to live in the same areas that they lived before. And talking about transportation, just as a follow-up question, there is all this talk about new ways of transportation like sharing cars, basically electric cars and things like that. But if we still believe that individual transportation is going to be the same model instead of focusing on things like public transport and trying to convince people that they can spend a little bit more time instead of just the convenience of basically hailing an Uber or just using a shared car, maybe that's a better use of materials and resources. Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Any more questions? Aquí, sisplau. For the translator, sorry, wait a minute, wait a second.
Related to the circular economy and its linked to consumption, but I haven't heard anything about the model, the economic model that still prevails and will still continue prevailing in the coming years, in which competitiveness and profit, etc., is what the rationale that steers the process. Maybe you can comment on it.
Yeah.
Third question here. Any more questions?
Thank you very much. It's a really spectacular series of slides. I guess my question, and this is the same challenge that Salvador Milà is facing, and that is having the funding to take a communication strategy to the public instead of the intellectuals in this room who understand most of it. How do we get the public to understand these complex ideas? What a simple life.
No more questions? Okay. The floor.
Okay, thank you. So just to begin with, are other countries making the same mistakes that industrial countries have made? Obviously, the short answer is yes. That especially in transportation, where China many years ago decided that one of the keys to its development strategy, was going to be the automobile. And this was well after we all knew that the automobile creates a lot of problems. This was in the early 1990s. And they said, this is going to be part of our industrial strategy, because in their view, automobile production, in part because it uses so many materials and stimulates so many industries, was an economic driver for them. So there are economic incentives out there, and of course a lot of special interests that promote particular patterns of development. Not to be overly pessimistic, though, I would also say that some of the best ideas, very innovative ideas, come from developing countries. The whole idea of bus rapid transit developed in Curitiba, as you know. And so they put on their thinking caps and came up with a transportation system based on buses that is the functional equivalent of a metro system at much less cost, as you know, because those buses can they board everybody, people buy tickets in advance, they board everybody at once very quickly, just as you would on a metro. And often drivers have control over stoplights, so the bus can keep going. That's a brilliant idea, and one of the slides that I skipped over showed how bus rapid transit has grown very rapidly around the world just in the last couple of decades. So there are good ideas, and we are learning, and I hope that other developing countries are also learning from each other as well. In terms of the ethics of consumption, I think this operates on different levels. You can talk about an individual ethic, which is what I was trying to get at toward the end when we talk about some of the actors who can shape the way that we think about consumption. So education could be playing a greater role. The faith world could play a greater role. Advertising, I don't see that there's much hope for turning advertising into a positive force. I mean, there might be. There are certainly public service announcements and those kinds of things that promote good things. But really the big problem is on the other side, where we have so much advertising that's encouraging us to over-consume. That's not helpful. So there's a whole set of ethics there. How the economics plays into that, certainly, producers rely on advertising to generate more sales, for sure. But if we as consumers were to lower our demand, this is a big system that we have to address here. If we were to lower our demand either individually or because we work part-time. We work part-time, we're paid less, we consume less. And therefore, advertisers would have to look at us as different kinds of beings because they know we're not going to have a lot of disposable income to over-consume. So I think it's a huge question, and it's a very rich question that has many, many different avenues, I think, to look at it. And then the third question I've forgotten already. Can you?
The challenge of taking the message to the masses.
Yeah, taking the message to the masses. Very big challenge. Again, I mean, it's the same as the ethics challenge. But again, I find some signs of encouragement. Do you know that people who are between 20 and 30 in the United States now are the first generation in my country's history to not where more people don't seek to own a car. That is, the interest in owning a car has fallen fairly dramatically among young people in the United States. There's still a lot of cars, a lot of roads, they're all still being built. It's not an answer, but it does show that people's perceptions can change and do change. And so I like to hang on to anecdotes like that because they give me some hope that change is possible. I would also say, I think I was very impressed by Salvador Rueda's one of the things that most impressed me was his understanding of the psychology that is necessary to bring about change. That it doesn't happen overnight and it doesn't happen with un golpe, with one big push. That it happens strategically, it happens intelligently, and it takes time. And I think sometimes if we step back and look at a larger range of time, we will see that many changes have happened for the good in our lifetimes. They're just not happening fast enough. And then the question is always, how can we accelerate those changes?
Okay, thank you, Gary. Just wait for a minute. We will present you a video on the metropolitan trends in the new urban agenda and institutional statement. Please watch the video.